Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. We're up to Unit 5 today, so welcome wherever you are, and warm welcome, and I'm sure you're looking forward to the weekend. Well, it's Thursday. Well, no, it's Thursday, isn't it? We've still got a little way to go. So what I want to do is I'll share my screen shortly, and then what we'll do is we'll have a look at where we're up to and where we're progressing through the Lunch and Learn series. So let me just share the screen. And there we go. So we're going to look today at conflict. Now, whether we're working remotely or not, conflict is inevitable. And two people on a desert island, there will be conflict. So it's not something we can avoid, although many people do avoid it or try to avoid it, but it doesn't necessarily go away. So let's have a look at the program and where we're up to. So you'll notice, of course, we've gone through 4 modules and we're up to Unit 5 today. And we're going to look at that whole issue, as I said, about conflict. Now, you might say, why have I included negotiation in there? Well, negotiation is a form of conflict, and it's a mild form of conflict, but it's nevertheless a form of conflict, because whenever you have to negotiate with somebody about something, you basically have a difference of viewpoint, because if you were on the same page, of course, you wouldn't need to negotiate. And because there's a difference of viewpoint, of course, you've got to navigate your way through that. So negotiation is a form of conflict. And of course, working remotely, you've got to negotiate with a variety of people about many, many things. All right, so let's launch in and have a look at where we're going. Now, the first thing I want to look at today, which isn't, I guess, directly related to conflict, but nevertheless, I think it's something that's important. And I put this into the program because I thought working remotely, this can sometimes be even more challenging, because sometimes out of sight, out of mind, that is political awareness. So I think all leaders have to be politically aware. Now, that might seem obvious to you, but I've talked to many, many leaders who would say to me, oh, I just come to work, I do my job, I'm not interested in politics and so forth. Well, I think as a leader, you have to be politically aware. I mean, it's part and parcel of what the role is. And I'm going to share with you a model on that. And then I'm going to share with you a model on conflict. Now, I don't know whether you had a chance to complete the conflict resolution diagnostic I sent you at the last session, but if you did, I'd have that handy. And if you didn't, well, you can just follow through and always complete that at the end anyway. So what I want to do is we're going to actually look at 5 different styles of dealing with conflict. And I think what the diagnostic does is it shows you which style you fit into, which one is most comfortable for you. But I would argue that you should be using all of the different styles when you're dealing with conflict, regardless of what the situation is. I don't mean every situation requires you using 5 different approaches, but certain situations with certain people require a certain type of way of dealing with conflict. And so I'll share that model with you, and we'll talk about, times when you should use that and perhaps not. I'm going to share with you 5 case studies to finish up with today. And the reason I'm going to show you those case studies is to give you a sense of how you might deal with each of those cases. Now, they're not all remote cases, I must say, but they're all typical cases that you would have dealt with in your time, regardless of whether it's now or in the future. And so knowing which approach to use to deal with those conflict situations might help you to put the model into context. Okay, so that's where we're going. And let's have a look at this political awareness model I just mentioned to you before, and try and understand how it works, and what application it's got for your work. So like a typical model, it's a 2x2 matrix, and you've got here at one end of the continuum, on the horizontal continuum, you've got game players. And I'm sure if you think about it, lots of people in your organization who are game players. These are people who are always looking after themselves, and they're always trying to gain some sort of an advantage, perhaps at the expense of other people. We also know, and hopefully we've got people who act with integrity at the other end of the continuum. So these are people that are very, very honest. They do the right thing nearly all the time. Fortunately, we've got people like that. Now, most people fall on that continuum somewhere between game players and acting with integrity. So it's rare to find someone who is on the extreme left or the extreme right in terms of this scale, but they do exist. I'm sure you'd be aware. Now, let's have a look at the vertical axis. Now, the vertical axis is at the top. We've got people who are politically aware, and these are people who are very clever and they know the lie of the land. They know how to operate the system and so on. I don't necessarily mean they do it unethically either. They just know how it works. And at the other end of the continuum, we've got people who are politically unaware. And I'm sure you know people like that. Most of us, of course, fall somewhere between the two extremes. So we end up with 4 different quadrants. And let's actually have a look at each and consider them. The very first quadrant to look at, for example, is those people who are game players who are politically aware. Now, these people we might classify as foxes. So we know that foxes exist in the workplace, whether it's remote or in the office. And we also probably know to steer clear of them. So they are clever, they are politically aware, they are game players as well. But the problem is everybody knows ultimately that they're a fox. And of course, they've got to be hugely aware of that. So we don't want you to be there. Now, the second one here are people who are politically unaware, but they are nevertheless game players. Now, we call them inept donkeys because ultimately they're not very good at playing the game because they're not very politically savvy. And so I'm sure, know people like that. They're easy to read. You can see them coming from a mile off. Now, again, we wouldn't want you to be in that quadrant either. So let's look at the other 2 quadrants. This one here is where people who are politically unaware, but act with integrity. So these are people who really aren't interested at all in being involved in politics, but ultimately they come to work, they do an honest day's work, and they go home at night. Now, we'd call them perhaps lambs, and I might say lambs to the slaughter, because if you're a team leader, I don't recommend that you be in this quadrant, because the fact of the matter is politics goes on everywhere. Politics goes on in all ways, shapes and forms, and we need to be aware of it. Now, this is where you need to be, and this is why I put this in perspective. You need to be in the top right quadrant. These are people who are politically aware, who act with integrity, and we might call them the wise owl. So you'll notice the 2, you'll notice it says politically aware and acts with integrity. So I guess the point about this Baddeley's model is this, that you can act with integrity and still be politically aware. And I think this is what turns a lot of people off, is that they think that being political is actually acting with a lack of integrity. But in actual fact, you can do that. So I would define political awareness as an ultimate form of empathy, where you can actually put yourself in the shoes of your stakeholders, so that when you do something in the workplace, you have anticipated the impact or the likely reaction and how it will translate. So in other words, by being able to anticipate that, you can act accordingly and make sure that the negative fallout doesn't occur. So I think being politically aware and acting with integrity is the place to go. I might also say that, of course, the further up the ladder you go organisationally, the harder it is to stay in that quadrant. And there's a good reason for that. It's not because people become corrupt because they have a position in the organisation, in the hierarchy. It's because the higher you go in an organization, the more difficult decisions are, the more they're not black and white, they're shades of gray. So, of course, and also decisions affect more people. So it's a little harder to act with integrity and even act with political awareness. I don't mean people could become dishonest. It's just hard to make decisions where there is a clear black and white situation. A lot of things can be grey. All right. So, but anyway, I think you get the point that it's a good idea to be politically aware. Now, let's look at the model of conflict. Now, this model is Thomas and Kilman's model. It's a relatively old model, but it's a very, very useful model to think about conflict. Now, let me just give you a sort of a heads up as to how it works. You'll notice that in this case, we've got the vertical axis talking about being assertive. So at the bottom there, it's low assertion. At the top, it's high assertion. And the other variable is cooperativeness. So on the left-hand side, you've got low cooperativeness. And on the right-hand side, you've got high cooperativeness. Now, within the spaces in the green area, you've got 5 particular positions that you can take on when you're dealing with any form of conflict, remotely or otherwise. So let's start with avoiding, because it's over in the bottom left-hand corner. Now, avoiding, that is, that's where you don't engage in the conflict. Well, obviously, it's not high on assertion because you're basically doing nothing. And, you're avoiding the situation. Now, you might think, well, avoiding is a terrible thing to be in, a terrible position to be in. No, there are times when I think it's perfectly appropriate to avoid, and particularly in remote environments. Now, across the bottom, you might say, well, hang on, how could it possibly be low on cooperativeness? Because the whole purpose of avoiding is so that I don't cause a problem. Well, you're not making much attempt to be cooperative either, are you? So by not engaging in the conflict, it's actually over on the left-hand side. So basically, you're not doing anything, in other words. Now, if we go up to the top left-hand aspect of the model, you can see competing. Now, competing, as you can see, is high on assertion and low on cooperativeness. Now, when you compete, it's basically a win-lose or a lose-win paradigm. So when you're competing with someone, you're attempting to win at the expense of the other person. Now, there's a time and a place for that, but ultimately, in order to compete, you need to be quite assertive. You need to state your position and what you believe in. But of course, when you're competing, you're not being particularly cooperative, are you? So therefore, it's low on cooperativeness, but high on assertion. And if we go all the way down to the right-hand corner, you'll see accommodating. Now, accommodating is the exact opposite of competing. Now, this is lose-win. So when you accommodate, what you're actually doing is letting the other person have it their way. Now, you might think, well, why would I do that? Well, if the situation is more important to them than it is to you, it might be prudent to actually accommodate. Now, in order to accommodate, of course, it's low on assertion for the simple reason that you're letting the other person win, so you're not standing your ground. But it's also high on cooperativeness because obviously by letting the other person win, you're being extremely cooperative. You couldn't be any more cooperative. Now you might think, well, when would I do that? Well, I'll get to some key, places where you could use that, which basically now leaves us with 2 others. And if we go up to the top right-hand corner, you'll see collaboration. Now, on first glance, you'd think, well, goodness me, collaboration is obviously the best of all 5 because it's high on assertion and high on cooperativeness, but not necessarily. When you collaborate with someone, what you're actually doing is you're working with them to come to a resolution. And it's got to be a resolution that you're both happy with. So often it's it's about working your way through a problem, and this is very relevant working remotely, of course, that you're working through with someone online about how you might move forward. So you're problem solving, basically. Now, you might think that's got to be the best way. Well, the problem, of course, with collaboration, you've probably guessed it already, is it takes time, because obviously in order to collaborate with someone, you've got to spend time with them to talk through the various options open to you. So therefore, collaboration does have that dimension to it. Now, the other one, which is probably in our society considered to be perhaps the most popular form, is compromising. And you'll notice it's halfway up the assertion scale, and it's halfway across the cooperativeness scale. And the reason for that is that when you compromise with someone, what you're doing in effect is you're giving a little bit and the other party is giving a little bit. So somewhere you're meeting in the middle. And a good example of that, of course, is buying a house. So when you buy a house, of course, what happens is, you have a figure in your mind about what you're prepared to spend. And normally the seller will have another figure in their mind, which is probably different to your figure. So what will happen is that somewhere in between those two numbers, there may well be a compromise if there's a successful sale. So you might say, well, why is it halfway up the assertion? Well, obviously you've got to make some concessions if you're compromising. So that's why you're not going to dig your heels in on everything. But by the same token, why isn't it 100% cooperative? Because surely that's what you're trying to do. Well, no one actually walks away in a compromising situation 100% happy, because obviously they've had to make some concessions. So therefore, it's halfway between the uncooperative and cooperative scale. So these are the 5 different approaches. Now, what the point I want to make about this is that to be good at dealing with conflict, you need to be flexible enough to be able to maneuver your way around and use a variety of different approaches. The problem is, and that's where the survey comes in, we all have a preferred modus operandi. In other words, we all have a preferred way of dealing with conflict. And because we have a preferred way of dealing with conflict, we're probably likely to use it more often than perhaps it should be used. So, for example, if you are very accommodating, you might find that you're accommodating in situations that really are not necessarily ideal for that. In other words, you're probably being taken advantage of. Or if you're very competitive, you might find that people are not quite so cooperative with you because they can see that you're quite competitive. So the survey that you did or can do, it really does highlight which of those 5 you favour and which of those 5 you don't favour. So the key thing for you, I think, in this survey is to try to look at the things that you have, you feel very comfortable with. And normally I would say a score of 9, 10, 11, and 12. 12 is as high as you can go. A score of a 9, 10, 11, and a 12 would suggest that you probably are using that too often. So in other words, you're feeling comfortable using that approach. On the other hand, a score of 3, 2, 1, or 0, which is your low scores, probably suggests that you could be using that style and that approach a little bit more. So basically, in any conflict situation, there are 3 variables. There's your style, which the survey can certainly identify for you. There is the style of the other person that you're in conflict with. Now, they may not have completed the survey, but they still have a preferred approach. And then there's a third dimension, and that is the situation that you're in. All of those 3 things, when you bring them together, will determine which is the better approach under the circumstances. Now, the good news for you is if plan A doesn't work, then instead of just banging on about plan A, you can try another plan. You can try another approach. And I'd actually encourage you to do that. So the idea is to be flexible and to be able to use these as much as you can. All right, so that's the model. Now what I'd like to do is actually look at some circumstances where you could use all five. And of course, I'll refer to working remotely as we go through this as well. So when would you use competing, which of course is low on cooperativeness, but high on assertion? Well, in certain emergency situations where you just can't afford the time to discuss issues, where speed and decisiveness are absolutely necessary, such as an emergency, you would probably just have to make a unilateral decision as a team leader without consulting your team. So in those circumstances, that would be fine. Now, of course, your team members would accept that there's a time and a place for you to make those unilateral decisions because of the interests of making it quickly and decisively. On the other hand, of course, if you use this as an excuse all the time, then people will probably realize and see through you that there is a time when you should be consulting. Another time when you would use this is when parties are refusing to cooperate with you, or they're taking advantage of your goodwill. And, you know, that could be your team members, it could be a stakeholder, it could be a manager, could be anybody really. And so if people are trying to take advantage of you, sometimes it's a good idea to actually put your foot down and say enough is enough. So that would be another time to use that. Another time to use it is where you just have to make unpopular decisions. Now, we all have to make unpopular decisions from time to time. And I think it's probably better sometimes to just make that decision and let people know rather than to try to sugarcoat it. And I see this happen all the time. Managers will spend time consulting with their team members when they've already made up their mind about what they're going to do. So don't fall into that trap. I think it's much better, and you will gain much more respect if you just simply say to people, this is how it has to be. I know it's not pleasant, but it has to happen this way. So I think there would be a time where you might just decide to use the competing approach. Now, accommodating, as you can see over here, is the opposite. Now, accommodating is where it's high on cooperativeness and low on assertion. Remember, this is where you let the other party get their way. So when would you use that? Well, this is probably the most relevant point, is if the relationship is more important than the issue, then it may well be prudent to accommodate. Now, those of us who are in personal relationships, we understand that sometimes we just have to accommodate, because by not accommodating, we might damage the relationship we've got, our personal relationship. So of course we understand we've got to accommodate. But in the workplace as well, there is a time and a place where accommodating is really important. And in a remote environment, for example, people are juggling home and work situations, whether it's homeschooling or whatever. And, it might be that they have some sort of issues that they're dealing with on the home front that need to be dealt with, and they perhaps would prefer to deal with it sooner than later. Maybe they've got no choice. And your job, of course, is probably to recognize that and accommodate in those circumstances. Because the argument is, if you don't do that, you might actually destroy the fabric of the working relationship. Now, of course, if you've got no chance of getting your needs met whatsoever, then obviously it would be prudent to just accommodate, wouldn't it? Just let the other person have it their way, because frankly, you have no choice. You can't have any impact on the decision whatsoever. And this is very relevant, of course, working remotely again. A third dimension, or a third possibility, is if it's not very important to you, why would you bother to get involved? And I mean, there's so many different arguments and situations that we can get involved in at work, regardless of whether we're working remotely or in the office, that it's just not worth it sometimes. And, you've got to, as the old adage goes, you've got to pick your battles. And I think that's very wise advice. So sometimes it's just not worth even going there. So why bother? Because you've got enough things to do and time is short. Now, avoiding when you first see it, you might think, well, goodness me, I mean, I don't like that. I mean, why would anyone want to avoid? Avoiding is a very relevant style in different circumstances. And let me give you some examples of when you would. Now, of course, it's low on assertion and low on cooperativeness because you're basically not doing anything, at least initially in the circumstance. So one of the times where that would be useful is diplomacy. So let's say you're having a Zoom meeting with your team members and somebody says something and you think to yourself, if I go out of my way to correct them here, I could cause a serious problem, or they might get their back up and frankly, we will miss the opportunity of getting a solution to the problem. Sometimes it's better just to say nothing, and particularly if what they say isn't really relevant to the issue that you're trying to deal with during the Zoom meeting. If you're putting off a decision, sometimes it's a good idea to buy yourself time. So in other words, if somebody wants you to do something on a Zoom call or whatever technology you're using, and you need time and space to think about it, then I would suggest the best way to deal with that is to say to the other person, look, leave it with me. I want to give it a little bit of extra thought and I'll get back to you, say by the close of business today. And that is actually a very important thing. And of course, it's not a fob off. It doesn't mean that you won't get back to them. You will get back to them. But what you're doing is you're buying yourself time. You're not committing to a solution at that point or a point of view. You're giving yourself the time to actually consider what can be done. Third particular possibility is where neither the relationship or the issue is important to you. Look, if it's not worth getting involved in, why would you bother? So sometimes, like accommodating, you just let it go. There's no point in you getting engaged in something that you have very little control over or interest in. And fourthly, sometimes it's useful to avoid when you need to know more. So, for example, you might be talking to one of your team members over a conference call and you don't have all the facts at your fingertips and you want to know more. It might be relevant for you then to do a little bit more digging, do a little bit more investigation so you can find out a little bit more about the issue before you commit to a resolution. And that would be a fair and reasonable thing to do where it's complex. But that's, again, not an opportunity just to fob it off and not do anything about it. It's still expected to come back and follow up on that. So collaboration now, as I said earlier, of course, it is high on assertion and it's high on cooperativeness. And you would think, my goodness, that's got to be the best. But as I said, the big downfall is, of course, it takes time. So when the situation that you're in, the issue and the relationship is important, so both of those things are at stake, then you may need to spend a little bit more time online talking to someone about it to come to a resolution where you're both happy. And what I mean by that is a resolution, not a compromise, but a resolution that works for both of you. All right. So this would be one possibility, because the relation. So a good example of this would be another team member working in another team who basically is on equal footing with you, and both of you have got an issue that you've got to deal with between your teams. Then that would be a classic case where you would actually try to collaborate, at least in the short term. Another case would be where the outcome satisfies both parties. So you're both strongly motivated to resolve the issue because it needs to be resolved. And if there's motivation on both parties to resolve it, then energy can be brought to bear in terms of discussing how it will be resolved. So that would be a case. Obviously, if one party is not very motivated to resolve the problem, whatever it might be, then collaboration may not work in that case. Another example where it would be very useful is where all parties need to be committed to a solution. So if there's it's a bit similar to the second one, but when both parties have a strong desire to get a result, a strong motivation, then obviously they can enter into a conversation or two or even three that might help to resolve that issue. And sometimes when you do collaborate with people, we often will get a better result than we would otherwise, because we're both trying to get to a position where we're both comfortable with, or we both want or accept. And that requires a little bit of creative thought. So it can be very powerful and useful in those circumstances. And I'm sure you can think of examples of that. Now, compromising, of course, is right in the middle between the two. It's halfway up the assertion scale and halfway across the cooperativeness scale. So compromising can be very powerful where you are attempting to collaborate with someone and you're just not getting anywhere and time's running out. And you might just say to the other party, look, we're going to have to meet in the middle here. I'm prepared to do this. If you're prepared to do that, how about we do that? So that's perfectly valid. If sometimes it can be used when, as I said, collaboration doesn't work, but also competing. So, you and one of your team members at loggerheads online, and you're just not getting anywhere. You're digging your heels in, they're digging their heels in. It's not going anywhere and it's not likely to end well. It might be appropriate for you at that point to make some compromise and for hopefully for the other party to do the same thing so that you can meet somewhere that is acceptable. Another case where that would be useful is in temporary short-term solutions. So you might say to your team member, let's do this in the short term. And when we get through the short term, how about we then come together and see if we can collaborate on a long-term solution. So that would be useful where time's running out. And finally, sometimes compromise is the only way. I mean, I think in a lot of cases, our society accepts that compromise tends to be considered to be the most acceptable form of dealing with conflict, generally speaking. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a heads up as to, when you could use each of these 5 styles. What I want to do now on the other side, I remember I'll be sending you these slides this afternoon and also a recording, but just remember this, that each of these, I'm not going to go through all of this, but each particular strategy, conflict resolution strategy, remember, has advantages and disadvantages. So, it's always about those 3 variables I mentioned before. There's your preference, there's the preference of the other person, and of course, there's the situation that you're in will determine which of those 5 approaches might be the better way to go. So what I want to do now is talk about some scenarios or some situations and give you a chance to consider how you might resolve each of these. So let me run through them for you. And I want you to think about this for a moment and think, if I was placed in this position, how would I deal with it? So situation 1, let me read it through to you and I want you to have a think about it. A customer calls you and they want you to handle an order for him, okay? But you no longer work in that team and it would create a major problem internally if you cross departments. However, the customer who orders a moderate amount of product has been very insistent with you. Now, clearly they're coming to you because they've got a working relationship with you and they don't know the ins and outs of what's going on in your business. but they think that you could perhaps take that order for them. So let's start with the things that you wouldn't do, and then we can start to work out what you would do. Now, you can't really avoid it, can you? Because I mean, obviously, they're on the phone or they're online with you. They want you to answer this for them. You can't really avoid it. So that's out immediately. I think that if you compete with them, in other words, you say to them, look, I don't deal with that department anymore. You need to ring Fred or Mary. I mean, whilst in some respects you're right by saying that and you're competing, you're probably going to annoy them because they perhaps might construe that as being uncooperative. So I'm not sure that's necessarily a good way to go. But on the other hand, if you caved in and did accept the order, even though you know full well it's going to cause a problem internally, then it may be not a good idea either, because if you did that whilst you'd please the customer, you're going to have a little price to pay when you talk to people in another team who have clearly laid down some guidelines about, various work that comes in. So that's going to cause a problem internally, which ultimately means it only leaves you with two options. You can either compromise or you can collaborate. Now, I think it might be prudent for you to say to the other person, that is the customer, look, I no longer work in that department, but what I'll do is I'll make an introduction for you and we'll set up a Zoom or a team call tomorrow, and I will hand you over to the person who is best positioned to do that. Now, I think that's a great solution. So that's probably a collaboration where you would, look for a problem-solving solution. And I mean, why wouldn't the customer want that anyway? Because all they want at the end of the day is their product or whatever it is that you're selling. On the other hand, you might compromise by saying to them, well, look, I'll take the order this time, but you must realize that I'm no longer working in that department. And if you'd be happy next time, could you contact so-and-so? So that's sort of a compromise. So either of those could work well, but I don't think the other three are particularly useful. Now, what about situation two? Now, I've been in this situation. It's not very pleasant. You probably have too. It's not really a remote example, but I think it's so typical, I wanted to put it in. You've had your car in for a repair, and although they claim it's fixed, you have the same problem. So it's not a regular fault and it's obvious. You've paid your bill when you collected the car and you're not prepared to pay any more. All right, so they are the only dealership that it is at all convenient for you, but you want your car fixed properly now. Okay, so let's have a look at what you shouldn't do. All right, so I can't imagine that you can avoid this because you want your car now, don't you? So that avoiding's out immediately. I don't think accommodating is correct, because you remember this, you paid your bill for a particular reason, that you wanted something fixed. Now, clearly it's not fixed. And therefore, if you just simply accepted what they said, you're probably likely to be paying another bill and probably quite angry about it as well. So that's not a good way to go. Now, let's look at compromise. Well, you could compromise, I suppose, but at the end of the day, the key point here is that you paid your bill. So therefore, by paying your bill, you're expecting a certain service and it's not happened. So I can't imagine sort of how much you could compromise in that circumstance. And I guess you could collaborate as well. But I really think that in this circumstance, it would be appropriate for you to compete. Now, I'm not suggesting you should jump up and down with hostility, but I think you should be firm, assertive, and just remind the dealer that you have paid your bill, that you came in because of this situation. You have found that it's not fixed, and you'd like it fixed immediately, please, and then try and find a time when they can fix it. I think that would be reasonable in that circumstance. Now, number three, this is something that is very relevant, I think, remotely. I find this quite relevant. You're a manager of a team that currently has a manual recording system, and your analysis shows greater productivity if it's automated. Susan Jones runs a similar kind of operation in another team. She disagrees with your proposition, citing customer concerns and employee resistance, plus technical problems with the system you're proposing. But your manager has told you to resolve the situation with Susan because you both must run the same way. So the manager's delegated to you and Susan to sort out, and you and Susan are on equal footing. So you can't really lord over her or vice versa. You've got to actually try and work this out. So you can't avoid it again, because obviously your manager wants a solution. I'm not sure that competing will work well here, because Susan seems to be as strident about her point of view as you are about yours. So you're both going to be at loggerheads there. Now, I don't think you should accommodate either, because your system, your system of automation could actually be a good system. Obviously, you believe it is, but if you accommodate, then you're sort of virtually discounting the possibility of that working, because you're almost, caving into Susan. So quite frankly, I think the only way forward here is to collaborate. Now, you can't really compromise, because a system, any system, should be either automated or manual. I mean, it's a bit hard to do both. It's a bit silly and cumbersome to have both. You have one or the other. So compromising is not really going to work. I would suggest that probably the best way forward here is for you to say to Susan, look, let's do it your way for a week. And then we'll do it my way for the following week. And then after that, we'll get our teams together and work out which is the better way. And then we'll let the boss know. That's a collaboration. Now, if Susan feels very strongly that her approach is the right way, then it's likely that she'll accept that. Now, situation 4 is a very interesting one, because it happens more often than it should, and it's quite a controversial one, but let me read it through. Your boss has a personal dislike for one of your team members and insists that you fire that person, or perhaps not renew their contract, if you want to put it another way. Whilst you recognise some occasional problems, you can manage that quite easily, and that person is in fact important to the team output. So what do you do? Now, you're in a difficult position, but let's look at what you shouldn't do. Well, I think of all those 5 approaches, the one that I would not adopt would be accommodation. If I just did what my boss said and not renewed the contract of that person who's quite technically proficient, even though occasionally they can be a pain in the backside, then I'm going to have a price to pay for the rest of my team, who are probably thinking to themselves, well, when my back's turned, what do you do when my back's turned? So that's probably not a good way to go. Now, let's have a look at some other options. You could potentially avoid it, thinking that the boss might have just had a bad day and they didn't really mean it. And of course, if they come back to you again and follow that up, well, then obviously it's an issue. Only you will know that, because you know your boss. You may well compete. I can see why you might just respectfully let the boss know that, frankly, they are very useful for the team, and we can't just go around sacking people on personal dislike. That would be certainly, legitimately a reasonable position to take, but it depends on the culture and the boss and everything else. Now, it's possible that you could collaborate, in the sense that buy yourself some time by making sure that the person in question understands that they need to perhaps be out of sight. And remotely, that's very easy to do, of course. Or perhaps you can let them know that they should have minimal exposure to your boss because it's rubbing them up the wrong way. So having a frank discussion and explain to your boss that that's what you're doing, so that hopefully that can be resolved. So I think I can see some value in those sorts of solutions. And finally, before we wrap up today, one more solution that I think is required. So let's work our way through this one. As manager, you want to design a new system in a way that suits you. Your approach at the managers' meeting is to raise it with the other managers who are all affected by the proposed new system. One of the other managers says it's too costly that way and that each manager should simply offer their approach and the GM make the decision. So you're in a meeting, you come to the meeting, you have a new way that you want to do things, and you've probably invested a little bit of energy into developing that. But as soon as you start talking, one of the managers says, oh, it's all too hard, and just bump it upstairs. So what this is about is your response to that person once they have said that. Well, accommodation's not a good way, because if you did that, then you are depriving yourself and your team's possibilities of coming up with something that's really valuable for the team. Can't really avoid it because obviously, they've made their comment and you've got to respond to it. So I can't see how you can avoid that. You could, I can see, you could compete to some degree, but if you get their back up, you may get other people in the meetings back up, and that might cause problems. So I think the solution here is to compromise. So I might say to the other person, look, how about we discuss this first? And by the end of the meeting, if we can't agree on a way forward, then I suggest we take your option and bump it upstairs. So I've compromised. So I've given myself time and space to argue my point. And also, of course, I'm also conceding that if I can't convince the rest of the team, then it might well be useful for the general manager to make the decision. Okay, so look, what's the key messages out of all of this for you today? I think the key message for you, or three messages actually, is be flexible. So, next time you're in a conflict situation and something isn't working for you, don't keep banging on with it. Try a plan B or a C or a D or even an E if it's possible. Don't overuse your preferred style, because if you overuse it, you'll be less effective as a team leader. And this applies working remotely or in an office. And in some cases, it's more relevant working remotely. So be prepared to be flexible and don't overuse your style. And aligned with that is that if plan A doesn't work, then you know what? Try a plan B, try a plan C, and so on. So folks, your homework ultimately, but before I meet you next week, is to practice all 5 approaches. Try to use all 5, and in different circumstances, of course, and don't despair if one doesn't work. Then what it means is you need to then move to a plan B, whatever that might be. And next time we meet, I'll be sending you out another diagnostic to do, which is one that's to be done online, which is an influencing capability profile, which I designed, because next time we meet, we're going to talk about influence and how you can improve your ability to influence other people and situations, albeit working remotely. So folks, that's it from me. I'll just stop sharing for the time being. So thank you, everyone. I appreciated the opportunity of working with you today, and I look forward to seeing you next week. And I hope that you've now got a little bit more sense making, if you like, on when to use the different forms of conflict. So thanks, everyone. As I said earlier, have a wonderful weekend when it arrives, and take care. Thank you. See you next week. Thanks and goodbye.